The courtroom was quiet except for the soft shuffle of papers and the rustling of clothing as people took their seats, the air heavy with anticipation. Everyone waiting for the trial to begin. The accused stood tall in the defendant's box, his face stoic, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the room as if he were a man detached from the reality unfolding around him, a man who had already seen much worse than what this moment could offer. His name was James, but to the world, he was just another black man accused of a crime he didn't commit. It was a robbery, the kind that shocked the small town. A local convenience store had been held up by a masked man, and the suspect had escaped with a large sum of money. But there was something about the case that didn't sit right with those who had followed it from the start, not least of all James himself, who had been dragged into this by forces far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. The judge entered the room with a thud of his gavel. The court was in session. The prosecutor stood up with a confident look on his face and addressed the court, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He painted a vivid picture of the crime for the jury: a man bursting into a quiet store, demanding money, and fleeing without a trace. But that was where the story began to unravel. James had been arrested within hours of the robbery. He had been found in the area nearby with the stolen goods in his possession. It was almost too perfect a suspect, too easy to pin the crime on. James had been found guilty in the eyes of everyone who didn't know him, but for those who did, there were questions that no one had dared ask. Yet as the prosecutor continued his argument, laying out the case with facts that seemed irrefutable, James remained unflinching. Every detail added weight to the story, making it feel more and more real. The prosecutor called the first witness to the stand, a local store owner. The man was visibly shaken as he stepped forward, his hands trembling as he swore to tell the truth about what he had seen that night. He described in vivid detail the figure he had seen running from the store, the tall man whose face was hidden in the shadows, the one he had seen fleeing the scene just moments after the robbery. He described the bag that the man had carried with him, the very same bag that had been found with James later that night. The store owner's voice cracked as he recalled the events, his testimony adding yet another layer to the prosecution's case. The jury listened intently, hanging on every word. The witness was confident, his account flawless, but something about his certainty made James uncomfortable. The man spoke as if he had known exactly what he had seen, yet no one had mentioned that the store's security cameras had been down that night, or that no one else had actually seen the suspect outside of his testimony. It was odd, almost too convenient. The prosecutor then called the two police officers who had been involved in the arrest. They took the stand one after the other, their uniforms pristine, their faces unreadable, as they began to recount the night of the arrest with meticulous detail. They spoke about how they had spotted James running down an alley just moments after the robbery, and how they had chased him down, cornering him near a dumpster. They described finding the stolen money in his bag, a damning piece of evidence that tied in directly to the crime scene. James didn't flinch as the officers spoke. Their words were steady, their voices unwavering, but something inside of him shifted. He knew they were lying. He could feel it in the air, the way the officers stood with such confidence, the way their stories seemed rehearsed. It was clear now that they were part of something more than just a simple arrest. They were hiding something, and James was starting to understand that the truth behind his arrest was far more dangerous than anyone had realized. As the officers finished their testimony and the prosecutor prepared to rest his case, the tension in the room thickened. The jury was already leaning toward a guilty verdict, but the defense hadn't even had a chance to speak yet. The weight of the evidence seemed insurmountable, and yet James knew the truth. It wasn't his truth alone, it was a truth that would soon be uncovered. But for now, the world continued to see him as just another man accused of a crime he hadn't committed, and the courtroom waited with bated breath for the defense to step in. As the prosecution rested its case, the room fell into a hushed silence, the weight of the evidence hanging heavy in the air. The jury seemed to shift in their seats, the tension in the courtroom palpable as everyone waited for the defense to begin. The defense attorney was a woman named Grace. Her reputation for being sharp and unyielding was well known. She had faced many tough cases, but this one felt different. There was something about James's calm demeanor that had caught her attention. When she first met him, he had told her that he was innocent, but it wasn't just his words that convinced her, it was his presence, the way he carried himself, the conviction in his eyes, that made her believe there was more to this case than met the eye. She stood up from her seat and walked toward the defense table, her movements slow but purposeful. The eyes of the jury followed her every step, her mind already working over the facts, the contradictions in the case, the holes in the story that no one seemed willing to ask about. She cleared her throat and addressed the court in a voice that was steady and confident. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began. She looked at them all one by one, drawing them in with her gaze. "Today, you have heard from the prosecution about a crime that was supposedly committed by my client, James here. But I ask you to remember something crucial. This is not just a trial of a man accused of theft. This is a trial of the truth. And we have yet to hear the whole truth." She paused for a moment, letting the words hang in the air, before continuing. "The prosecution would have you believe that James was at the scene of the crime, that he was caught red-handed. But I ask you to consider the facts. The prosecution has provided no evidence to support the claim that James was in the store at the time of the robbery. No fingerprints, no eyewitness accounts that tie him directly to the crime scene, except for the testimony of a single store owner who, we must remember, was not even able to identify James in a lineup prior to this trial." She glanced over at the jury, seeing their faces turn as they processed the information she was presenting. Slowly but surely the seeds of doubt were being planted. The store owner's testimony was shaky at best. Grace continued, "What about the so-called chase? The officers who caught James have given us conflicting accounts of what happened that night. They claim that they saw him running down an alley, but they have provided no clear description of him prior to that moment. The alley was dark and the suspect's face was hidden from view, and yet the officers managed to identify James with perfect certainty." She paused again, letting the words sink in. The jury was listening now. She could feel it. She could see the doubt creeping into their minds. "I'm not here to ask you to dismiss the evidence altogether, but I ask you to look closer, to question the facts that have been presented to you. We have all been told a story, but how much of it is true?" She turned her attention to the officers sitting on the stand, the two men who had sworn to uphold the law, who had testified about their capture of James. They sat with their backs straight, their faces betraying no hint of guilt, but Grace could see it. She could see the slight nervousness in their eyes, the way they avoided direct contact with her gaze. She knew they weren't telling the whole truth. The pieces didn't fit together. She took a deep breath and delivered the final blow. "The prosecution has provided no motive for James to commit this crime. No reason why a man who had nothing to gain would risk everything to steal from a store in a town he had no interest in. He had no prior criminal record, no history of violence, and no ties to any criminal organization, and yet we are supposed to believe that he would commit such a brazen act without reason." She let the silence stretch for a moment, letting the weight of her words settle in. The courtroom was still now. The jury was locked in attention, their minds racing as they processed the defense's arguments. James sat in the defendant's box, his gaze unwavering, the calm in his eyes never faltering. Grace knew the truth about him, and now she was determined to show the jury the truth too. But the truth wasn't something that could be handed to them in a neat little package. The truth had to be uncovered piece by piece, and Grace knew that the real story was far more complex than anyone in the room had anticipated. She wasn't just fighting for James's freedom, she was fighting to expose the hidden forces at play, the forces that had manipulated this case and made it so much more dangerous than it appeared. She could feel the shift in the courtroom as the defense made its case. The eyes of the jury were no longer so certain. The story was beginning to unravel, but no one in the room knew just how deep the rabbit hole went. Not yet. The air in the courtroom was thick with anticipation as Grace finished her closing argument. She could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her, the jury, the prosecution, the spectators, all waiting for what would come next. The prosecution had laid out its case with confidence, but Grace's words had planted doubt in their minds. The puzzle pieces that had seemed to fit so perfectly now appeared disjointed. The jury shifted uneasily in their seats, a sense of uncertainty sweeping over the room. But there was still one crucial thing that no one had yet considered: the truth. that had been hidden in plain sight. Grace had known from the beginning that this was not just a case of a black man wrongly accused of a crime. It was much bigger than that. There were forces at work here far beyond the scope of the courtroom, and soon the world would find out what they were. The judge gave a brief nod and motioned for a brief recess. The room erupted in whispers as everyone began to stand and stretch. But Grace remained seated at the defense table, her mind working furiously. She knew she had one last card to play, a card that would change everything. But she had to be careful. Timing was everything. Just as the courtroom began to empty, Grace stood up and motioned for the bailiff. She asked for a brief word with the judge. The request seemed unusual, but the judge saw the seriousness in her face and nodded with a grunt, signaling that he would grant it. Once the courtroom was empty, Grace turned to the judge. A quiet but purposeful conversation took place between them, Grace's voice low but urgent as she explained the gravity of the situation. The judge's face grew more serious as she spoke, and he glanced toward the door, as if wondering if they were being watched. He motioned for a clerk to join them, and the three of them stepped into a private chamber for a more secure discussion. It wasn't long before Grace's unexpected visitor arrived, a man in a dark suit who walked with purpose. He was tall and held himself with an air of authority, the kind that commanded respect. Without a word, the man entered the room and looked directly at Grace. Without hesitation, she met his eyes and gave him a small nod. The man turned toward the judge and introduced himself as an official from a government agency. The name meant little to the judge at first, but there was something in the man's presence that made it clear he was not just an ordinary figure. Grace could see the change in the judge's demeanor, his face hardening as the man spoke words that the rest of the courtroom would not hear, words that could not be spoken aloud, but words that would change the course of the trial forever. The man spoke of James's true identity, the one that the jury had no idea existed, the one that had been hidden under layers of secrecy. James was not just an ordinary man accused of a robbery. He was a CIA agent working deep undercover, and the case against him was not just a simple criminal matter. It was a complex operation that had been sabotaged from within. The forces of law enforcement, the officers who had testified against him, were part of a far-reaching conspiracy to discredit him and his mission. The revelation hit the judge hard, but he was quick to mask his reaction. The gravity of the situation was not lost on him or the official standing before him. The judge's mind raced with the implications of what he had just heard, but he remained silent, his expression unreadable. Grace stood still, watching the exchange with a calmness that only she could muster. She had known for days that this moment would come, but even she was taken aback by how swiftly the pieces had fallen into place. The courtroom had been set up for a very different kind of trial than anyone had expected, and now the truth was coming to light. The officials exchanged a few more words in hushed tones before the man in the dark suit turned to leave the room. He gave a curt nod to Grace and the judge, signaling that his role in the matter was complete. With that, the three of them returned to the courtroom. The audience was settling back into their seats, the tension in the air now palpable, a sense of unease hanging over the entire room. The judge banged his gavel, signaling the trial to resume, but Grace's mind was already several steps ahead. She knew that the next move would be crucial. It was time to take control of the narrative, to shift the spotlight from the charges against James to the much darker forces that had been manipulating the case from the beginning. The courtroom pulsed as Grace stood once again, her eyes steady as she looked at the jury, and then the judge. She knew what she had to do. It was time to reveal the truth to everyone. The courtroom would never be the same again. It was time for the shocking revelation that would leave the room speechless. The silence in the courtroom was almost unbearable as Grace stood up once again. She could feel the eyes of the jury on her, every move, the weight of the moment pressing down on her shoulders. As she slowly made her way to the front of the room, her mind was clear, but the tension in her body was undeniable. She knew that what she was about to say would change everything, and once the truth was out, there would be no going back. She turned to the judge and with a calm but firm voice requested permission to make an unprecedented revelation. The judge's eyes narrowed as he regarded her for a moment. There was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, but then he nodded with a sigh, signaling her to proceed. Grace took a deep breath and faced the jury, her heart pounding. but her voice, unwavering, the room was so quiet now that she could almost hear the beat of her own pulse in her ears as she began to speak. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have heard much in this trial. But what you have not yet heard is the most important part of this case. It is the truth that has been hidden from you, all the truth about my client, and the events that have led us to this moment. She paused for a moment, letting her words settle in. The room was on edge, the jury hung on her every word, and the prosecution looked on with growing concern. This was not what they had expected. Grace continued, her voice steady and clear. The man sitting before you is not just the man accused of this crime. His name is James, but he is not an ordinary man. He is a trained and highly skilled CIA agent, and what you have been hearing in this courtroom is not simply a case of a robbery gone wrong. It is part of a much larger and far more dangerous conspiracy that has been carefully hidden from the public eye. The room erupted into murmurs at the revelation. The audience gasped, some in disbelief, others in shock. As the truth began to sink in, James sat quietly in the defendant's box, his expression unchanging. But there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that spoke of the burden he had been carrying all along. He knew that this moment was inevitable, but even he hadn't fully anticipated the shockwave it would send through the courtroom. Grace continued with unwavering composure. The officers who have testified against James, they are not just regular law enforcement officers. They are part of a covert operation designed to sabotage James's mission. They have been working against him from the very beginning, and their involvement in this case is part of a much deeper plot that involves national security, corruption, and betrayal at the highest levels. She paused for a moment, letting the weight of her words hit the jury. They were stunned, visibly shaken by the bombshell she had just dropped. It was clear that the simple robbery case they had expected had now turned into something much more complex and far more dangerous. There was a murmur of disbelief from the prosecution, but Grace didn't give them a chance to speak. She turned to the jury, her gaze hardening. This is not just a trial for my client's innocence. It is a trial for the truth, the real truth about the forces that have tried to frame him and destroy everything he stands for, the truth that has been carefully concealed for far too long. She could see the confusion in the jury's faces. They were struggling to process what they had just heard. Grace took a step forward, her voice rising as she pressed her point home. You are now faced with the most important decision of your lives. You can either choose to believe the carefully constructed lies that have been presented to you, or you can choose to believe the truth that James is innocent and that the corruption in this case runs far deeper than any of us could have imagined. She let her words hang in the air for a moment before turning back to the judge. She could feel the tension building in the room, the atmosphere electric with the anticipation of what would happen next. The prosecution stood up, their faces red with anger. They had been blindsided, and they were not prepared for this turn of events, but Grace was ready for them. She knew that their next move would be to discredit her. She knew they would try to twist her words and undermine her argument, but she was prepared to fight back. She had one last card to play, and she was ready to reveal it. But not just yet. The judge sat quietly watching the exchange unfold, his expression unreadable, but Grace could see the subtle shift in his eyes. He was processing the information and weighing his options. She knew this would be a pivotal moment in the trial, and she was determined to see it through to the end. Her heart raced, but her resolve never wavered. This was the moment when everything would change, when the truth would finally be exposed. The courtroom buzzed with disbelief and confusion as Grace's words hung in the air. The revelation that James was a CIA agent had shattered the carefully constructed narrative that the prosecution had built around the case. Whispers rippled through the room as the jury exchanged uncertain glances, and the spectators leaned forward, eager to absorb every detail. The prosecution rose to its feet, their frustration evident as they faced Grace with visible anger. One of the attorneys slammed his hand on the table, his voice rising in protest. How dare you suggest such a thing, he snapped. There is no evidence to support these wild accusations. This is nothing but a desperate attempt to confuse the jury and derail the trial. Grace remained calm, her expression unchanged as she met the prosecutor's fury with quiet resolve. She knew what was coming. She had expected the pushback, But she was ready for it. Her voice was steady as she spoke. Your anger is understandable, but it is also misplaced. She said the truth is right before us, and if you choose to ignore it, then you do so at your own peril. She glanced over at the judge and then at the jury. She could see the unease in their faces. They were struggling to process the new information, but Grace knew she had them. They had no choice now but to consider what had just been laid before them. It was no longer a question of guilt or innocence, it was a question of what had really happened on that night, and why James had been caught in the middle of it. All the prosecution tried again, with a more measured tone, to question the validity of her claims. But Grace was ready for this too. She had anticipated every challenge and had already prepared her next move. She turned to the judge and requested that an emergency witness be brought forward, one that could speak to the truth of her claim. It was a bold move, and one that no one had expected. The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised, but after a brief pause he granted her request. The courtroom grew quiet once again as the door opened and a new figure stepped inside. The man who entered was not just anyone, he was a high-ranking government official, someone whose presence in the courtroom would have been enough to send ripples through the room. Even before he spoke, he was dressed in a dark suit with an air of authority that immediately commanded respect. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Grace. She nodded at him as he took his place at the witness stand. The tension in the room was palpable as the official was sworn in and the questioning began. Grace addressed him directly. "Thank you for joining us," she said. "I would like to ask you to confirm what I have just revealed about the defendant. James, could you please state his true identity and role?" The official cleared his throat before speaking, his voice steady but laced with the gravity of the situation. "I am here to confirm that James is indeed an active CIA agent," he said. "His mission was deeply classified, but I can state with certainty that he has been working undercover for months on a high-stakes operation. His identity was never meant to be revealed, and his presence in this town was not by accident." He looked directly at the jury, making sure his words landed with the same weight they had carried in the courtroom. James was the target of a sophisticated operation designed to destroy his mission and discredit him. The two officers who have testified against him were involved in this operation, and they were not unaware of his true identity. They had knowledge of his role, but chose to frame him for the robbery in an attempt to derail his investigation. Grace watched as the jury absorbed the news, their expressions shifting from disbelief to shock. The room was silent now as the magnitude of the situation unfolded before them. The prosecution was visibly rattled, their carefully constructed case unraveling with every word the official spoke. Grace turned to the judge. "I trust this clears up any confusion," she said. "But there is one final matter we must address. The officers involved in this conspiracy must be held accountable for their actions and the corruption they have brought into this courtroom." The judge nodded gravely, his expression dark as he processed what was happening in his court. This was no longer a simple case of a robbery, this was a case of national security and betrayal. And now the courtroom was caught in the crossfire. The prosecution stood frozen, unsure of how to respond to the mounting evidence of corruption that had surfaced in the last few minutes. Grace stood tall. She had known that this moment would come, but even she was amazed at how quickly the pieces had fallen into place. She had uncovered a web of deceit and treachery that had been carefully hidden, and now it was all coming to light. James sat still in the defendant's box, his eyes locked on the proceedings, his mind racing as the final pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The conspiracy against him was no longer a secret, and the truth was finally being heard. As the official's testimony concluded, the room was left in stunned silence, the gravity of the situation weighing heavily on everyone present. Grace knew the battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time since the trial began, she could feel a shift in the air. Things were about to change. The silence in the courtroom was thick like a dense fog as the truth began to sink in. The revelation about James's true identity had left everyone in shock. The prosecution was reeling, trying to regain control of a situation that had quickly spiraled out of their hands. The jury sat motionless, their faces a mix of confusion, disbelief, and growing concern for what they had just heard. The judge looked down at his papers, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk, as if weighing the implications of what had been revealed. Grace stood firm at the defense table, her eyes scanning the room. She knew that the path ahead would not be easy, but she had taken a crucial step in exposing the corruption that had poisoned this case. The courtroom seemed suspended in time as everyone waited for the next move. The prosecution seemed stunned, but after a long pause, they finally rose to their feet. The late prosecutor looked at the judge, then turned to the jury, his voice shaky as he spoke. Your Honor, and ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is nothing more than an attempt to confuse and manipulate the facts, he began, his voice rising with false confidence. The defense has presented no proof, no real evidence to support these wild claims. We have seen no documents, no confirmation of these supposed CIA operations, and there is no reason to believe that James is anything other than a criminal who has used his supposed identity as a smokescreen to escape the truth. The prosecutor's words echoed through the courtroom, but they fell flat. Grace had anticipated this. She had known that the prosecution would try to discredit the truth with vague dismissals, but the truth could not be denied. The official who had testified had given a clear statement about James's role and his involvement in the undercover operation. The official's words rang in Grace's mind as the prosecution tried to grasp at straws. The judge raised a hand to quiet the courtroom and then turned his attention to the prosecutor. I believe we have heard enough, said the judge, his voice firm and measured. It is clear that the claims made by the defense are serious and warrant further investigation. He looked down at his papers for a moment before continuing. I am ordering a suspension of this trial until a full review of the evidence can be conducted regarding the claims made by the defense. Grace exhaled slowly, her mind already moving toward the next step. This wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was a victory in that moment. The trial was paused. The prosecutor shot a look at Grace, his face twisted in frustration, but he said nothing. He knew that he had lost the upper hand. The judge turned to the jury and instructed them to return to their chambers for the time being. As they filed out, the tension in the room remained palpable. The spectators whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Outside the courtroom, the hallways buzzed with speculation as reporters and bystanders exchanged theories about what had just unfolded. Grace remained calm as she walked out of the courtroom, her thoughts running at full speed. She had won a significant battle, but there was still so much to uncover and so much more to expose. The conspiracy against James went deeper than anyone had realized, and the web of corruption involved high-ranking officials from various agencies. There were still people who didn't want the truth to be known, and they would stop at nothing to keep it hidden. But Grace wasn't afraid. She had taken the first steps toward revealing what had been buried for far too long, and she would not stop until the full story came to light. She made her way back to her office, where she sat down at her desk and began making calls to sources she had in various parts of the government, people who knew the truth, people who had the pieces that were missing. She needed confirmation on everything. The official's testimony was just the beginning, but now she had to track down the paper trail, the covert operations, the hidden files, the ones who were still working behind the scenes to cover up the truth. It was a race against time. She knew that the prosecution would not back down easily, and there were still forces at play that would do anything to discredit James and silence anyone who got too close to the truth. The phone calls were long and filled with technical details, but Grace's resolve never wavered. She had come too far to stop now, and she knew she had a responsibility, not just to James but to the public, to ensure that the truth was revealed to the world. She couldn't help but think of James sitting in that courtroom, his fate still uncertain despite everything he had endured. He had remained calm throughout the entire ordeal, and Grace admired him for that. He had lived a life few could even imagine and had seen things that most people would never know. He was not just a victim of circumstance, he was a man who had dedicated his life to something greater than himself, and Grace was going to make sure that the world knew his story, that the world knew the real reason he was in that courtroom. The battle had only just begun, and Grace was ready to fight it to the end. The following days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and late nights spent piecing together the fragments of a story that was bigger than anyone had imagined. Grace's office became a war room as she worked tirelessly to uncover every detail of the covert operation. that had placed James in the center of a conspiracy so vast and tangled it could bring down entire institutions. She had spent her entire career defending the innocent, but this case was different. It wasn't just about one man's innocence, it was about exposing the corruption that had been festering beneath the surface of the law for years. Every conversation Grace had brought new pieces of the puzzle, but also new dangers. She knew that there were powerful forces at play that would stop at nothing to keep the truth from being uncovered. The threats began soon after she received the call from an anonymous source who had been watching her movements for days. It wasn't a surprise. Grace had expected that once the trial had gained public attention, the opposition would escalate their tactics. She knew it was only a matter of time before they would try to intimidate her or sabotage her efforts. She wasn't worried about herself, though she was focused on James and what was at stake for him and for everyone who depended on the truth coming out. Late one evening, as Grace was reviewing more classified documents, a shadow appeared in her office doorway. She looked up, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone that was sitting just a few inches away. But then she recognized the figure. It was James. He looked worn, but there was an intensity in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He stepped into the office, closing the door behind him, and leaned against the desk, his posture a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. Grace stood up at once. "James, what are you doing here?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "You should be resting." His gaze met hers without hesitation. "I can't rest, not while I know the truth is still being buried," he said, his voice low and steady. "They're going to come after you, you know that, right?" Grace nodded slowly. She had prepared herself for that possibility. She was in this for the long haul, and she wasn't going to back down. But it wasn't about her safety, it was about the bigger picture and the truth that had to come out. She leaned forward and met his gaze. "Your name will be cleared, but more than that, the entire operation will be exposed. We're going to bring them down together. But you need to stay out of the public eye for now. Let me do the talking, and I'll make sure you're protected." James didn't seem convinced. He shook his head slightly and sighed. "I don't know if I can just sit back and let you do it all by yourself," he said, his hands gripping the edge of the desk as he spoke. "This isn't just about clearing my name. This is about making sure they can never do this to anyone else again. I need to be a part of this. I need to make sure the people who put me in this position pay for what they've done." Grace knew there was no reasoning with him. Once he set his mind to something, he would move heaven and earth to make it happen. But she also knew that he had a unique understanding of the situation, one that no one else could possibly grasp. The stakes were higher than they had ever been before. She sighed deeply, knowing that the path ahead would be even more dangerous than she had imagined. If James was going to stay involved, he would need to stay under the radar. They couldn't afford any more slip-ups. The pieces were already in motion, and there was no turning back now. "We do this carefully, we move when the time is right, and we strike at the heart of the conspiracy," she said, her voice firm. "We'll make sure you're not just cleared of these charges, but that the system that did this to you is exposed for all to see." James nodded, his expression hardening with resolve. But there was something else in his eyes, a question that he hadn't asked yet. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "What's the next step?" he asked. Grace knew he was ready for whatever came next, and it made her respect him even more. She stood tall and walked over to the desk where she had spread out several files. The pieces were starting to fit together, and she knew that the final push was coming soon. She picked up the phone and made one last call before turning back to James. "We're going to need to pull everything together. There are people within the system who are willing to testify. We'll need to meet with them in private and take down those responsible for the cover-up. But we're not going to do it without a plan. The plan would take time." But Grace was confident they could pull it off. They had no other choice but to do it right this time. Everything would depend on it. The next few days were filled with secrecy and tension. Grace and James worked in the shadows, piecing together the final elements of their strategy. They had to move quickly but carefully, knowing that any misstep could ruin everything. Their plan hinged on getting the key witnesses to speak without drawing attention. They needed to expose the corrupt officials without alerting them to what was coming. Every meeting, every conversation was carefully orchestrated with precision. They didn't have the luxury of making mistakes. There were too many lives at stake, not just James's, but the lives of everyone who would be affected by the fallout from the truth being revealed. Grace had contacts in high places, and they had all promised their cooperation, but there were risks she couldn't ignore. The deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. There were whispers of surveillance, of people watching their every move. Grace couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She had known this wasn't going to be easy, but the closer they got to the truth, the more perilous things became. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder and jumping at the slightest sound. It wasn't just the opposition that posed a threat, it was also the silence from their allies, the fear that someone would back out at the last minute and leave them exposed. But James was unwavering, his resolve only grew stronger with each passing day. He wasn't just in this for his own freedom anymore, he was in it for everyone who had been wronged by the system, for every person who had been silenced and forgotten. The deeper they dug into the conspiracy, the more names came to light, names of officials who had been involved from the beginning, and the realization hit both Grace and James that they were not just fighting a local case anymore, they were fighting a system that had been operating in the shadows for far too long. The day of reckoning was approaching, and neither of them could afford to wait any longer. They had to act fast or risk losing everything. Grace stood in her office one afternoon, looking over the files spread out on her desk. James was with her, both of them staring at the documents that contained the evidence they had worked so hard to uncover. It was almost time. She could feel the tension building in the air. They had enough to bring the case to a head, but it had to be done right. They couldn't just drop everything at once. It had to be methodical. Grace turned to James, who had been silent for a while, his eyes focused on the papers in front of him. "I'm ready," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Grace nodded, but she knew that James's readiness wasn't just about his personal stake in the matter, it was about his willingness to fight against something bigger than him. He understood the magnitude of what they were up against, and he was willing to risk everything to make sure the truth was heard. They had to get the evidence to the right people and quickly. But they couldn't trust just anyone. Grace had already arranged a secure meeting with someone she knew could help them get the word out without risking exposure. It was a delicate operation, and every move had to be calculated. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The day of the meeting arrived, and Grace and James traveled under the radar to a location far from the public eye. They were meeting in person with a trusted journalist, someone who had the connections and resources to take the evidence to the media without drawing unwanted attention. But even as they prepared to reveal everything, Grace knew they couldn't afford to trust anyone fully. They had to be careful about how they moved and who they spoke to. Every step had to be calculated down to the smallest detail. The journalist greeted them with a handshake and a nod, but Grace didn't let her guard down. She knew that the moment they handed over the files, there would be no turning back. The entire operation was about to be exposed, and the world would never be the same again. As the journalist took the evidence and promised to act swiftly, Grace and James exchanged a look of quiet determination. The moment had arrived, and there was no turning back. They could only wait and hope that their efforts would be enough to bring down the corrupt system that had framed James and so many others. The waiting was the hardest part. Every minute felt like an eternity. As Grace and James sat in the small room watching the clock tick away, each passing second seemed to stretch longer than the last. But they knew they had done all they could. They had placed their trust in the journalist who had promised to go public with the evidence. But now it was out of their hands. The world was about to learn the truth, and there was no telling what the fallout would be. They had uncovered a web of lies, so vast, so intricate, that exposing it would cause shockwaves across the nation. Grace's mind raced as she thought about the people who would be affected by the revelations, the corrupt officials who had worked to frame James, the officers who had played a part in the conspiracy. They all had something to lose, and Grace knew that they would fight back with everything they